This is Phase Ed Music.
Do you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no.
Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
If they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
Hello and welcome to Friday Night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And we'd like to call this Tomorrow's News Today.
Yes, a bit odd, isn't it? Because we are going to be reviewing the week's news, but we like to think that by reviewing things, we give you an indication of stories that are coming up. And we've broken Tomorrow's News Today quite often, haven't we, Hardeep, on Byline Times?
We have, from many different issues. I mean, most recently, the scandal around the government's procurement of PPE, spending millions and millions of pounds on contracts to Conservative donors and companies with questionable experience.
And also, things like the scandemic movement, COVID denialism, and American coverage. We were covering sort of the rise of right-wing terrorism there, particularly with our correspondent, CJ Willmar. Well, let's look at our front page today. We've just devised our weekly front page, digital front page, and it's a fever pitch, a moribund state. So I often like to describe what we do is we hunt down volcanoes and earthquakes.
We do.
And, where news is happening, because anybody knows geography, I did it at A-level, so I'm going to bang on about it. Plate tectonics, there are major things, shifts happening in history and in politics and in culture, and it's along those lines, those fault plates, you get earthquakes and volcanoes. So obviously the big volcano of the last 2 weeks has been the number of coronavirus deaths, and the underlying issues there are really interesting, aren't they, Hardy?
Yeah, I mean, the coronavirus crisis really has revealed so much that was already rotten in the state of Britain, unfortunately. And it seems to have come at a time of a dual crisis with Brexit and the reality of that kicking in. But yeah, I mean,
well, so that our headline
issue.
writer, the chief story today is by Jonathan Liss, who's one of our excellent writer who writes for Byline Times. And earlier, only a few hours ago, Hardeep talked to him about Boris Johnson's performance in the coronavirus and how Britain had fared.
And how would you describe the dynamic between the government and the public during the coronavirus crisis?
Well, I think that it's not so much the government is blaming the public, it's that the government wants the public to blame each other. Because even though the public is kind of caught in the waves, the government is behaving much more cynically. So it's very much in the government's interests that whatever happens, they escape blame. And that has been the overall kind of guiding principle since the start of the pandemic. Also, there was very much a PR element to everything. And so, the government never misses, certainly people like Johnson, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So, obviously it was the Daily Mail front page this week about having a statue for Captain Tom, and Johnson getting behind it is kind of like a perfect kind of Johnson story. It's like an archetypal Johnson story. It's a good news story. It's riding on the coattails of something. It's capitalising on an individual sacrifice, not something that Johnson would know anything about. Trying to associate himself with that individual. I was joking on Twitter. The only thing that the main difference between Captain Tom and Boris Johnson is that only one of them has helped fund the NHS. So obviously that's kind of what it's always been about, presentation, and about massaging figures and about making sure that the government looks like it's on it. So remember way back at the start in the first lockdown when everything was about the 100,000 target for testing at an arbitrary date. And so the governments, they scrambled to get tests in the post, for example, so they could make the target. And that seemed to kind of encapsulate the approach, which was to kind of make headlines rather than to actually combat the virus. And I think we've seen that throughout the pandemic as well. But in terms of the government blaming the public, they've done something very clever, which is to kind of absolve themselves of responsibility, but to put that responsibility onto individual people. And so now to have this guilt tripping where they kind of, first of all, it was sunbathing, it was dog walking, now it's exercise, and the last couple of weeks has been look them in the eyes and tell them that you've been following the rules, tell them you've been socially distancing, tell them you've been working from home, and all this stuff, even though the government has been confusing its messaging on this from the very start. And I think it's rather more pertinent that the government should be able to look those people in the eyes and tell them why they delayed the lockdown in March and in October and in December, which has far more impact on case rates. Look them in the eye and tell them why they weren't paying people to self-isolate, why they're still not paying people to self-isolate, which we know is the most important factor why the virus is still spreading. Because if you are symptomatic and you can't afford to self-isolate, then you are necessarily going to spread the virus. But there's also the opposition, because that's clearly how the media can't report opposition to the government, mainstream opposition to the government, if it doesn't exist. So if people aren't kind of full-throatedly attacking the government's whole policy, then the media is not going to report that. And I suppose that it's not necessarily a bad strategy from Keir Starmer to hold back and to focus his criticisms on individual aspects of the government's response rather than a kind of a broad blanket overarching strategy, partly because Labour is in office in Wales, partly because Starmer has himself kind of tacked most of the government's responses to it, and so it would seem ridiculous to then attack everything. But at the same time, that hasn't stopped opposition parties in the past. The Conservative Party supported the Iraq War, but still used it as a major plank in its 2005 election campaign, saying they lied about the Iraq War, which they continued to support. And Michael Howard said he'd have voted for it again. So it was kind of, so opposition parties can have leeway. They don't need to kind of, they can, if you like, have their cake and eat it a little bit, in as much as anyone in politics can. So it's kind of, I think that Starmer decided that people wanted to give the government the benefit of the doubt, they want to rally behind the government. And it would seem like at a time where national unity was called for, it would be unpleasant or unedifying or in poor taste to attack the government. And when he came to his position, Johnson was in intensive care.
And just finally, Jonathan, what do you think that the coronavirus crisis has exposed about Britain? Which is a very big question, but I guess when I say that, what's the sort of instinctive thing that comes to you?
There are so many things. I suppose one thing I would mention is the kind of obsession with laws and a kind of a pettiness and an obsession over what the regulations are, the arguments that we've had over Scotch eggs and park benches and mingling and just total nonsense, and denouncing our neighbours, reporting them, reporting people for going on a walk twice a day in last spring. I mean, that is kind of just the pettiness that exists, and it's a lack of seriousness in the discourse that we're not prepared to that it's much easier to talk about whether you're following this rule or that rule and about how you can get around this particular rule rather than focusing on why we have those laws to begin with. Britain is obsessed with law rather than obsessed with the reason behind those laws. And I think we've got something really wrong in this country in that we think that people are there to serve laws when actually laws are there to serve people. And I'm not actually that interested in what a law says about something if the purpose of it, if the purpose is for something else entirely. So, when it says you can't go for 10 miles or 50 miles or whatever to go for exercise, when it's completely safe to do that if you're in your car or whatever it is. And so that's I think that it's really exposed that and this idea that we have of ourselves of a freedom-loving country, that East German style communism or totalitarianism can never have kind of landed here because we love freedom so much. And it just goes to show that if it ever had, then 30-40% of the population would have signed up as informants in the first month to report on neighbours. We are just the same as other people. It's just exposed the ludicrousness of our exceptionalism, I suppose, is what I'm getting at.
Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's fascinating, Hardeep. I mean, particularly that thing about us not really being a freedom-loving country.
Absolutely.
That we would snitch on our neighbours. It's a terrible truth, but I kind of agree with Jonathan on that. Arguing over these trivial things. And I suppose the thing about freedom is, we've never really tested it in lifetime. We go back to the war, Major Tom and all these images of people who are in the furnace of the fire who tested their resolve. But we've just been sitting around watching TV and, moaning.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for us in this country to take our democracy for granted, but we know that there are people in other parts of the world who are really, really fighting for their lives. I mean, let's just take a look now at what's happening in Russia, where protests have erupted across the country with the jailing or the sentencing of the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny.
Yeah.
He's been sentenced to more than 2 years in a penal colony. I mean, do you want to explain a bit more about what threat he poses to Vladimir Putin's rule?
It just reminded me, it's basically a penal colony. It's a gulag, and we're back to Dostoevsky, the great novelist, and Solzhenitsyn spent time in there. There's a long history of that. Yeah, Alexei Navalny is the remaining opposition leader. I mean, most of them are dead. Nemtsov, who was the main threat to Putin, was murdered, shot outside the Kremlin. And of course, they attempted, Putin, it can but be him, nobody else but him, because it was with Novichok, there was an attempt to kill Navalny by inserting Novichok, the nerve agent, which was used to target Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, a Soviet defector, or a Russian defector. And they tried it, and he survived, hospitalized. The plane just landed in time. John Sweeney's done a great piece for us on Byline TV on that, and they saved his life, went to Germany, and decided to go back, which is an amazing story. Having released this film, which we'll hear more about in a moment, about Putin's corruption. Anyway, we're very lucky to have our writer Zarina Zabriskie, based in America, a Russian citizen, who has got some amazing footage of the demonstrations from a company called Acute Angle. And these are the demonstrations that happened over the weekend. There's been about 2 weeks of demonstrations, particularly on Monday, when Navalny was sentenced to 2.5 years. As you can see from these demonstrations, they show kind of police following around, stopping taxis, arresting people willy-nilly, because there have been thousands arrested, but even more importantly, many more thousands demonstrating. And you can see the kind of brutality that the cops are using on protesters in Russia. This across all time zones, right from the Far East in Yakutsk all the way to Western Russia. Mass uprising of people and an attempt at oppression. There's no doubt that the security services are very worried. I mean, earlier I spoke to Zarina Zabriskie, based in San Francisco, and she explained to me how she's been documenting and what is really going on in her homeland. Well, Zarina, you have been tracking these protests for 2 weeks now. And explain to us a little about that film we've just seen, which shows quite brutal violence. What's been going on in the last 2 weeks in Russia?
Yes, Peter. Well, people in Russia, all over Russia, are at the boiling point, as one of the protesters in St. Petersburg told me. People have been fuming for years, for decades by now, because the country is poor. And as Navalny noted in his last address during his court hearing on Monday, the talk he hears in his cell is all about the prices on eggs and pasta growing while salaries are being frozen. And while in Moscow and St. Petersburg, people are living somewhat okay, the step out of the capitals and it's real poverty, according to Navalny and according to all of my sources back in Russia.
So
what was happening before, people were staying at home and watching video bloggers on YouTube and didn't know that they could come together. But after Navalny came back to Russia from Germany, after surviving the assassination attempt with Novichok, people raised, because what he did, he conquered fear. He showed that it's possible not to be afraid. And in Moscow and St. Petersburg, unprecedented. And the numbers are being argued right now, but we're talking tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands people in the streets. There are small and big towns that are stepping out into the streets. There are villages that never had protests before. In Nizhny Tagil, hundreds were in the street and they never seen any demonstrations anti-government up to this point. There's a small village of Berezniki, people marching and chanting, Putin is a thief. And what is important that people are not just united by pro-Navalny and justice fight emotion. It's anti-government, anti-Putin, anti-corruption.
What's your prognosis? What will happen with these demonstrations?
Well, what happened, Peter, this historic memory got erased by 2 decades of heavy propaganda of mass media that is funded by Kremlin. And what Navalny did in this video, in the first part of the video, which by the way has English subtitles and that I recommend our audience to watch, it's on YouTube still, it exposed the whole history of Putin's rise to power, and not just the St. Petersburg episode, but a lot of corruption that happened, and exposed the structure of the whole appropriation and the, this major steal by the Kremlin from its people to the people. And now it will be much harder for the government to suppress this protest because people are aware, people are less afraid. And that was shown by this massive appearance showing off in the street. And what is the prognosis? It's hard to tell. I spoke to a lot of people preparing to this interview and writing my articles. There's no one opinion. There's a lot of conspiracy theories. However, what is clear to me is that nothing in Russia will change dramatically unless the army, the security services, riot police, the National Guard side with the people. As of now, I'm quite sad to report they are not siding with the people. I read a few interviews of the officers. They are apolitical. They are more siding with the government. They are hooked on their salary, apartments, right to live in big cities, and they will not let it go easily, and they are brutal and they are suppressing the protests. So until that happens, nothing can change because the change won't come from the top. Putin is not going to resign. He will be immediately, he will be no more if he resigns. He's only alive and free because he has the protection of his power. There's no turning back for him. His closest environment, can they turn on him? It's not impossible. I don't see it happening anytime soon. What are the other scenarios? We don't know. If somebody knows, please contact me and tell me.
In the meantime, you mentioned the brutality of the police. As you say, interestingly, they for propaganda purposes, have overestimated the number of arrests to deter people. But we do have video, maybe you can explain this, about the arrest of Navalny's doctor, a very senior doctor. Explain a bit about this video we're watching.
Yes, of course, Peter. Actually, before the second protest of January 31st, the government prepared really well. They arrested pretty much every coordinator of Navalny's team, every activist, every blogger, every journalist who was openly criticizing the government or calling people to step out to protest. So even before the 31st of January, the prison cells and detention centers were getting full. And by now, by the way, there are vans, police vans driving around St. Petersburg and Moscow, taking people around with no toilet, no food, no water, standing up for hours and hours and days on end. And it's only getting worse because there are more people who are getting arrested. So Dr. Anastasia Vassilieva was one of the arrested. She is a very important figure in this whole opposition landscape. She is the head of Doctors Union Alliance, and she is the doctor who treated Navalny after the prior attempt on his life when I think it's called brilliantine, this green medicine, which is very toxic, was thrown in his face during one of the appearances by him. And she is very close to Navalny. She was arrested under very dramatic circumstances. She kept playing Beethoven while she was being arrested. And it's a moving scene. You will see it in the video. And since then, she's been sentenced to the home arrest. And not at her residence address where she has 2 children and she's a single mother, but she's separated from her children. One child is sick with asthma. She's not being allowed to attend to her family. And all of these people are so courageous, so noble in the way they show this resentment, this anger. And the lawyer who speaks to me is also risking his life or freedom at this point by just giving this interview.
So, Zarina, I mean, I think what you do is very noble, and we hopefully will share a link if we can help support, because I think citizens around the world can stand up and support Democrats in other countries when they're a threat. Meanwhile, we'll hopefully speak to you again very soon with hopefully good news or more news from, from Russia and what you're seeing with your contacts there. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll speak to you again very soon.
Thank you, Peter.
It's just extraordinary.
We're back.
It's just extraordinary what's happening, Peter. I mean, God, these people out on streets in Russia, they're really making history in a way, aren't they?
Well, the thing is, and the same is happening in Belarus now for 6 months. They're struggling for their rights. And what I find amazing is the way they break through the propaganda. Putin, Lukashenko, they really dominate all the mainstream media. It's worse than here. And even the internet access. But when you shout in the street, and they're sort of communicating through all these different networks. You see people coming out in Irkutsk. 5 hours later, you're waking up in the Urals and you go, we can come out. And it shows you that you can't fool the people full the time. Propaganda has its limits. And, I just wonder if we'll get through our own propaganda.
I hope so. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this notion of making history and the weaponization of history. I mean, that's certainly been something that's been a feature of Putin's Russia, hasn't it?
Well, and they still deny. They've recently changed the law, so it is now a crime to mention the historical fact that Hitler and Stalin had a pact to carve up Poland, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the secret protocols. So yeah, they're trying to rewrite history, and I think the job of a journalist is to stop that happening or to write it more accurately. But we're not free from this in the UK, are we, Hardeep? And
No.
You've been exploring quite often in your work about how history, about empire is rewritten. And you talked earlier, didn't you, to one of our great writers on, actually is writing a book on fake history. That's Otto English, also known as Andrew Scott, his real name. You can see the joke, Scott English. And you spoke to him about how we're rewriting the past, yes?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it was really sort of interesting that the very sad death this week of Captain Sir Tom Moore, who died of the coronavirus. He raised more than £30 million for the NHS by walking laps of his garden last year.
Just to stop you there, apparently an NHS charity, not the NHS.
Right.
So.
Yes. So I spoke to Otto about that and how the sort of developments surrounding Captain Tom's death perhaps reveal something deeper about how we kind of weaponize history in this country, or those in power do, and where that might lead us, and what the danger is when we have myths and realities and we don't know the difference.
Don't give it all away now. Let's go back and then let's go and see that interview which Hardeep did earlier today with Otto English.
As the son of a man who fought in World War II, and as someone who is very much in tune with sort of the cultural war narrative that's sort of engulfing us in this country, and having just written a book about fake histories, talk to me about why you found events this week slightly troubling.
So, as you say, Tom Moore is a hero, and not a hero in terms of a military hero, but a hero in terms of the fact that he was heroically old and yet didn't want to sit around waiting for telegrams or death. He got on with it. That's the heroism of Tom Moore. He was an elderly man who wanted to do something useful with his time, and he wanted to get out there. And for those guts and that determination, I think he's legitimately a hero. What bothers me about the Tom Moore story is the way that it has been appropriated by people in power and people of influence to a large extent who got behind it, which is fantastic. Influencers and the Piers Morgans of this world pumping up the story and therefore adding to the amount of money he made. I think he made £30+ million walking and from his #1 record, which is incredible. But firstly, why did he have to do that in one of the richest countries on earth, which has a national health service? And secondly, it taps into this sort of increasingly religious attitude that people have to the Second World War and to anybody who was in it, particularly men who were in it, I have to say, because women are totally sidelined in the history of the Second World War, and a lot of women served in uniform. There were a lot of women heroes who've been largely sidelined by the narrative. The narrative is that every man who was there was a hero, and that's nonsense. Tom Moore, just by dint of being an old soldier, I think gathered much more attention than he would have got if he'd been a coal miner or some regular person or a woman, because I think a woman did actually do a very similar thing, but we haven't heard her story to such an extent. And so he's been leapt on. He's been leapt on almost like a sacred amulet by the Boris Johnsons and by the War Christmas gang who want to have this sort of who believe that these sort of things, these people can somehow get us through this crisis. So I was uneasy with that. And I was even more uneasy when there were campaigns for him to get a state or ceremonial funeral and to turn him into some sort of symbol of coronavirus, because I think when the days of reckoning come, we need to remember coronavirus as a tragic mass event and a popular event, and I don't think that government should be allowed to take control of that narrative when they've been responsible for so many dead people in this country.
And why do you think that some people watching this, or, you know, I'll start that again, that's not a good question. And also for many people in the country, or indeed members of the public, have sort of expressed their support for what Captain Tom did. There was a big outpouring when he died. I mean, can you see why, for the general public, at a time of crisis like the coronavirus, having a symbol such as Captain Tom is sort of comforting? And why do you think it's, sorry, what am I trying, I'm just trying to think. I'm trying to, yeah, why?
It is comforting,
Yeah, right, sorry. I'll just phrase it one more time. And also there'll be lots of members of the public who, you know, for certain, what is it, Captain Tom, sorry. One more time, sorry, I'll say. And also for many members of the public, Captain Tom be, you know, quite a heroic, comforting figure, especially at the time of the coronavirus. And I mean, we can understand that. And it is sort of, there is a sensitivity around discussing the somewhat unedifying sort of weaponization of a man who, by all accounts, you know, had a lot of integrity and humility, and said that the focus of his walks and his fundraising should absolutely be on the NHS workers. I mean, that message seems to be getting lost in what you're sort of phrasing as this wider narrative of almost a religiosity of our historical wins.
Yes. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. What he did was great. The guy was an inspiration, and he was a large chunk of light in the darkness. And you know, when I saw that he'd died, I felt choked. My children certainly did. That he has definitely become a symbol to a lot of people, and a symbol of heroism.
But is there something wrong with that?
I think it can get overblown, and that's what's happened here. And also, I really strongly believe that a lot of people feel disquiet about it and don't feel able to say anything. And I think a lot of people in public life probably think that.
Yes.
So as it snowballs and gets ever bigger and demands for a statue and a state funeral start coming along, I suspect there's a lot of people feeling uneasy about it. And I think maybe that was demonstrated by the lack of clapping. So on Monday night, Boris Johnson, was it Monday or Tuesday, Boris Johnson encouraged everybody to go out and clap at 6 o'clock. Well, anecdotally, from what I gather from Twitter and what people have told me from around the country, very few people clapped. I don't think that's disrespect to Tom Moore. I think that's unease with the Prime Minister trying to cash in on the Tom Moore legacy. And it's very difficult to challenge that narrative, because if you do, people say, well, how dare you? How dare you insult Tom Moore? How dare you insult this national hero, this centenarian who did this extraordinary thing? How disgraceful. It is weaponised in the most literal sense, isn't it? It's a complete weaponisation of an event and a person. And that, as you say, completely takes away from what he did and his motive, which was very clear. He said in multiple interviews that he was doing it for NHS workers. And I'll come back to the original point, which is why the hell should he have had to do it in the first place?
Exactly.
Well, you can see the full interview with Otto on our Patreon site. There you can also see the interview with Jonathan and Sabrina, both of whom are writers, all three I should say, for Byline Times2. So you can see the whole video on Patreon and read their work on Byline Times for free. But I'm going to have to go soon. I'm going to leave Hardy behind with Stephen Colgrave, my co-founder, to answer your questions on Q&A. And by the way, all you guys commenting on YouTube, we can't answer. You've got to come on over to Patreon and we'll answer your questions because we're doing the print edition, aren't we, Hardeep? Let's have a quick look at our provisional front page. And, well, you can see what we're working on. It's busy. This time of month is pretty busy for us, isn't it?
It is, yes.
So you will forgive me taking my departure. I'm going to have to go quickly. Carry on with the paper. Italicizing, that's my nightmare, is the italicization.
Very important.
Hardeep picks up all the typos. But it's great fun. The print edition is very different from the online edition, which is always going to be for free. It's only a quarter of the content. Unique stuff, like I think Jonathan, this is one of his pieces is going to be unique in print. Same with Peter Oborn's diaries. So I have to go and do that. And Byline Times is paid for by your subscriptions for the print edition, which is very special, only select top quarter, redesigned, re-edited. Meanwhile, Byline TV, if you enjoyed it, it's not paid for by oligarchs, is it, Hardeep?
No.
No advertising, as far as I've seen. I have an iPad here. If Apple want to pay me to show them product placement, we might do that. It's funded by you and your kind donations, and you get these benefits in kind by going over to Patreon. You get the full videos, and you get to ask, not me this time, you're going straight to the boss, Hardeep, for the questions, and then my other boss, my co-founder, who knows all the answers, where all the bodies are buried, Stephen Colgrave. So meanwhile, from our, what we like to call Friday night with Byline Times, tomorrow's News Today, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
See you next week.